Welcome to the Global Stewardship Podcast, a life update for you all, not because you've been waiting for one or asking for one, but because it is going to greatly affect the future of this podcast for the next several months throughout this year. I recently found out that I was pregnant, very pregnant. I think I'm 14 weeks pregnant, and it's been a whirlwind of emotions and cascading events. I found out because our dairy cow started absolutely repulsing me. Her smell, her milk smell, just everything to do with her. And unfortunately, we had to pass her off to another local farm just because I could not handle the milk smell and the responsibilities right now. That was hard, and so that kind of kept me off the podcast for a few weeks. And also we didn't really see this coming, so planning our year accordingly. As farmers, we plan everything out really, really down to the day, pretty much. I felt really fortunate that last time, we kind of had a plan, and we do really feel so blessed that we are able to conceive, and obviously just without even trying. And so I don't want to sound like we're not so grateful. We are so excited, so grateful, and just so happy to be able to tell our now 2-year-old that he's going to be a big brother. It's been a really fun time, but just have been kind of nauseous. I think I'm getting over that hump now, but as I only have probably a month left of pre-recorded episodes to post, I'm going to take several months off of the podcast. I'm going to be putting all of those out, so just keep listening while I'm posting them. And also want to do an episode about WWOOF, the program, WWOOF, the program through which we host all of our volunteers here on the farm. They have been so critical and crucial for us, especially in this time. They run everything here so smoothly alongside us, and especially as we're going into the busy planting season, lambing season, chick season. Springtime is the busiest season for us. Having them here is just something that is so fantastic, and we're always so grateful for them. So I am going to be posting those episodes. I just wanted to share that because there's probably not going to be very many after this spring, just until maybe fall or winter. So FYI, that is coming up, and we're so excited about it. So today I am sharing an episode that I recorded with my friend Shannon. You guys have heard me talk about my trip to England. I had been to England before, but I went to England last year in 2025, and it totally changed how I view the country, how I feel about the UK. It was a fantastic trip, and when I went, I had maybe a day or two notice, and thankfully I had been following Shannon just because of all of her beautiful farm pictures for, I don't know, probably a couple years at that point, and just reached out to her. We didn't know each other really, and she gave me some of the best recommendations for what to do. I was going into it totally blind, and that is ultimately what led me to finding some of my favorite places on the planet and creating what was a fantastic trip. Speaking of that, I know I've also mentioned recently, and some of you may have signed up for it, the trip to Northern England this summer. It was also a crazy series of events because within 3 days of each other, 2 groups of 2 canceled, even though they had paid a non-refundable deposit. I did refund their deposit and everybody else's, but I took that as kind of a sign. And then shortly after, I found out that I was pregnant and probably wouldn't want to be leading a trip that pregnant anyways. So it's just crazy how everything falls in line and everything works. Something that we thought at the time was so strange now totally makes sense. And we make plans and God laughs because obviously he knew better and he orchestrated everything. So we will definitely be taking a group to England at some point, but we will not be doing it this spring. Was it spring, early summer? So just FYI. But Shannon will be talking about some of those areas, and I thought she would be the perfect person to have on the show because she really did open my eyes to a whole new world of things about England that I didn't know. And she has a historical background. Curates museums. She is a wonderful person. I had such a great time meeting her and her little one, who's around Willie's age, when we were there. And so that was just a fantastic time. Enjoy the show, And if you feel so inclined, I would love for you to still leave a review at the end because this is something that I want to pick up. Like I said, I had no idea that we were going to be pregnant. And so I'm just going to take a little bit of a break, but keep pre recording more episodes to drop later in the year. So if you could leave a review, that would be fantastic. Thanks, guys. You started chatting with me about your mixed background in farming. You didn't grow up
Mhm.
farming. Can you give us some background on what brought you to this life?
Yeah, it isn't my background at all, actually. So I sort of accidentally fell into a lot of my interests around farming via my partner, who is a stocksman. So he essentially runs livestock for a sort of couple of farms, one at a museum, so sort of traditional heritage-based farming. My background is sort of history, heritage. I have a huge kind of interest in sort of concepts of England, the English landscape, uh, like how we form Englishness through the landscape, like a sense of identity through the landscape.
Mhm.
And they tie together a lot with farming. So I sort of accidentally got into the farming side of things. But they tie quite well into kind of my interest and my background with work on like vernacular buildings, so particularly like farm buildings and rural buildings. So there's kind of like a mix going on of that. But as I've been with my partner, I've got more of an insight into like the daily workings of sort of farming life. And we live in a really quite rural northern farming community as well. So having those connections and just seeing like the pattern of life has been really interesting.
As we go throughout this episode, do you plan to kind of talk about those connections to history and agriculture?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think they're a huge for me, they're like the interesting side. The farming side is really interesting here. But I think what's also interesting is like the pattern of farming has really continued, particularly because I'm in the north, along a lot of historic lines. There's just this thread that goes through in some ways that feels so unchanged. From the language you use, the remnants all around us,
Mhm.
everywhere you go, there are remnants of that old farming life everywhere, even changing practices. You can just see it has completely shaped our landscape, and it is like farming made England look
Yeah.
the way England does. And so I can't talk about historical buildings or like the nature of our landscape or the concept of how we create a sense of national identity. It's all so linked to the countryside and agriculture and all of those kind of things.
I saw that when I was staying with Lee and Neil. You look out their window and you can see across the landscape like several different farming styles throughout history because
Mhm.
and so much of it is the stone walls, but
Yeah.
you can see the stories right out in front of you. It's
It's
really magical.
it is. It's like you can see it still all across the landscape. We've been farming for thousands of years, so since the Neolithic period on this island, and our kind of real foundations of English traditional farming come from the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, who kind of set up the pattern that would become English farming. So everything kind of centered around the village and communal land, the kind of strip farming that you would see through the medieval period as well. Everything is still there, even down to like the layout of the hedgerows, the layout of the dry stone walls. They're ancient. They've been marking our landscape for millennia. Obviously, life has changed so much here, but it's so unchanged as well in so many ways. And I think farming allows you to have that feeling of being connected through this long lineage of time, and the way that our landscape is marked by farming as well, that kind of passing down of those techniques through the ages, and how many people, it's like an unbroken lineage.
Yeah.
um and I think, but as well, we're still about 90%, I think it is now, of UK farming is like small scale family farming. So we are dominated by that system still, which I'm very grateful for, because I think it creates a completely different system. I think people who are second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation on their land are tied to it in a completely different way, understand it in such a different way. I always wonder if people can be hefted, like sheep can be hefted, that you are so linked to that landscape and you know it inside out. And I think you care for it in a different way than conglomerate farming.
Yeah.
Pass on skills that you've learned from your parents, that they learned from their parents, and you have this real tie. And I think it has created like such a deep pride in both place and also the work that people do. I think that probably leads to a lot of the kind of, we have really high animal welfare standards in this country. We've led the way even prior to kind of a lot of the EU rulings. And I think that's a part of this family farming system. I think bolsters that people really have so much of emotional investment in their farms, in their farming, whatever they're farming, be it livestock or arable.
Yeah. I was actually thinking about that yesterday and wondering, why is it that farming in the UK seems so unique and different to me from the rest of the world? And I think obviously history is a major part of that. But I also wonder if you can tell me, but is it that people don't have access to large acreage? Here, people are farming just thousands and thousands and thousands
Mm.
of acres. You guys are literally on islands. Like,
We're on an island. I was looking at the sizing of farms, and actually, we're farming slightly bigger farms than some of mainland Europe, but they're still not obviously massive compared to North American farms. And I think you and I talked about when you were here this idea of not owning, but of tenantship.
yeah, yeah,
So there are still thousands of tenant farmers. That comes from obviously a really old system, and that is deeply rooted in the way that we farm. That comes from through the Anglo-Saxon period, through the medieval period, into like the manorial system, where you're tenanted to your lord. Basically, it's the sort of that feudalism, but it just lasted for centuries, and people are still tenants. So it's this idea that you don't have to own the land to be a custodian of it,
yeah.
and pass it on. There's lots and lots of people still making a living as tenant farmers. The largest sort of landlord for tenant farmers in this country is actually the National Trust, which is a heritage organisation. So the National Trust set up in the Edwardian period to sort of safeguard mostly kind of built heritage assets, but has always included land custodianship in that as well. And I think it's interesting that a heritage organisation, you're number one for tenanted farmers, really.
Yeah.
It's about that kind of sense of custodianship over the land and protecting ways of farming and protecting that system.
Before we kind of pivot to talking more about the farming, can you just clarify for people? You had said that your husband farms for several different people, what
Yeah.
that might look like.
Yeah, so he's a stockman, so livestock, which is really common in the north. There's a huge north-south divide in the way that we farm. That's down to topography, really, climate and things like that. So a lot of livestock farming in the north. So he manages, I suppose, a fairly small scale venture for a sort of a heritage organization. So farming in traditional breeds in a traditional way, including rare breeds. So everything's done without major machinery. There's a sort of 1940s tractor, but a lot of it's done in a traditional way, in a kind of way that hasn't changed for centuries. Just small scale management of quite a small flock, as well as a small herd of cattle. So it's very along the lines of the type of farming that existed here up until about the 60s in our area. Lots of kind of subsistence farming, essentially, like small holdings and things like that, using local and native breeds. And then he does, I think, I don't know whether that's common in North America, but there's lots of people that work in agriculture that don't have their own farm, but manage flocks or manage some of the farming systems for other people. And people kind of move around and do agricultural work that way. I suppose that is their in into kind of an agricultural work in a system that's probably quite hard to get your foot in the door for farming if you haven't grown up on a farm,
Right.
um, and haven't inherited the ship or the farm. I think it is quite a hard um industry to kind of get your foot in the property door of, because there's just not a lot of farms. There used to be like council farm tenantships that came up, but they're disappearing, and there's not many opportunities if you're younger to get into to farming that way. I think we talked a little bit about because you've spent time in the north, and I'm biased because I'm northern. Um, and farming looks different in the north and the south
Yeah.
because we have different climates, and the sort of geology, the topography is really different. So down south there's a lot of arable farming. It changes the landscape though, so you see less of the kind of enclosed fields with the hedgerows and the dry stone walls. They're much more open, particularly now that heavier machinery is being used. You just need your kind of open fields to be able to get in to do your big crops. So there's lots of like cereals grown down there, some of our veggies and things. Whereas the north, because the landscape's quite tough,
Hmm.
the climate's quite tough, um, and the soil quality is often a bit poorer. It's traditionally always been focused around livestock grazing, particularly sheep. So sheep have always been really important to the way that farming has worked, and sheep do really well on like poor soil, really. So
Yeah.
you can kind of turn them out, and it's sheep that have completely shaped the landscape and the look and that kind of traditional iconic English scene that you would think of. So when you think of the Yorkshire Dales, it's sheep that really transformed a lot of that. There's
Mhm.
obviously cattle as well, but it's that kind of uh, they shaped the field systems, and they shaped the way a lot of the economies, local economies work. So during the medieval period, the English economy basically ran off wool. It was so profitable that it made us really wealthy, and it was like a integral part of our economy, and that symbolism sort of has lasted culturally as well. So you see it in a lot of towns, in like place names or street names. And also our chancellor still sits on something called a woolsack. So
Oh, cool.
yeah, the sack of wool, because it was so important to our economy. There's so many of these kind of threads, even if people are urban and not living in rural communities. It's threaded through our culture so much. It's threaded through both the landscape and some of the words we use and the idioms that we use and things.
Mm.
But in the north, definitely that kind of quintessential kind of dry stone wall landscape is really shaped by that kind of farming. And
Yeah.
it's really unique, I think. You see it in that some other places like the Cotswolds where they have a lot of sheep, but we also have the most native sheep breeds out of anywhere in the world, so about 64. And that is they're a regional base, so they're kind of were bred to do well in their certain environments. And it's nice to still see. It's changed a little bit. Like we've got a few things on the rare breeds register, but you still see native breeds dominating their regions, which I think is really nice
Yeah.
to still see. Yeah, they're obviously so well adapted. So you'll still see Cheviot sheep a lot when you're in sort of Northumberland. The Herdwicks are protected in the Lake District, and then lots of Swaledales when you're around the Yorkshire Dales, and mules as well that are crossed out with Swaledale. There's been imports from Europe because, like everywhere, productivity is key, isn't it? And you're trying to kind of make the most. Things are getting harder and harder, and those European breeds, beef ob, do really well. Um, but it's nice to still see how dominated kind of our farming is by local breeds and by native British breeds.
Yeah. That's super special.
Mhm.
Yeah. Definitely compared to here, there's very few people who farm native breeds of really anything. And if you do, it's not like, it's just so special there that it's so tightly bound to certain
Mhm.
little areas. It's not remotely like that here. You could drive like 20 hours and still find the same breeds,
Yeah, I
totally
do love it.
random.
I love when you go somewhere new and then you spot their their breed. I think there is something really quite special about seeing that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's so cool.
I still kind of get excited because they're so well adapted. I always think, particularly with the Herdwicks in the Lake District, they look like they belong. The color of their fleece
Oh, they
matches
blend right in.
matches the fells. Yeah, they're part of that landscape and have been for millennia. And I think like still have them all there is amazing.
Yeah. Gosh, where did I go? It's that famous, oh my goodness.
Yew Tree Farm.
Yes. Yew Tree Farm. Yeah, because they're tenant farmers, that's kind of part of their deal is they have to
Mhm.
continue to farm Herdwicks.
Yeah, there's a lot of so the Lake District National Park, a lot of it was safeguarded by Beatrix Potter, the children's author, famous obviously for Peter Rabbit. And she sort of used her wealth once she'd sold her books to buy her first farm in the Lake District. She wasn't from the Lake District, she was from London originally, so grew up in the city and came from quite an upper middle class background. And lots of wealthy Victorians had holiday homes in the Lake District because it had this romanticized, beautiful idea. And people really loved the landscape, and she fell in love with it. And she was integral to conserving it, really, and conserving the farming way of life. And she acquired lots of farms that were tenanted as well over her lifetime and donated them to the National Trust, of which she was a founding member as well. And so they hold like thousands of acres of that sort of Lakeland fell area, and there's lots of provisos in it because she left provisos about protecting traditional farming, and so they include things like keeping flocks of Herdwick, so keeping the native breed going, which I think is wonderful, really, to still see them there and not see them replaced because they're quite rare. Uh, and obviously they don't always have the best yield, I would say,
Yeah,
but it's the importance of keeping that traditional method of farming because the Herdwicks are farmed in a different way than some of your lowland breeds. So they do so well on the fells and they spend most of their life just turned out kind of communally on the fells. So you've protected a way of life and a pattern of farming that wouldn't
yeah,
be there if you replace them with a modern breed, because the modern breeds require different kind of care.
for sure. You
Mhm.
keep saying the word fells. I'm sure that people listening have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, so we will use things differently and interchangeably, but dales and fells. The fells are sort of the Lake District has hills and mountainousy,
Hmm.
very mountainousy landscape. So the fells are each individual kind of peaks or the fells. So you get your fell ponies that are also native English breed are from that area as well, that were all turned out communally. So it's really high kind of landscape, a bit mountainousy, quite rough, very poor soil, and the sheep are just turned off out, and they do so well on like harsh landscape. They do really, really well on it because they're perfectly adapted and have been bred to do so for millennia, really.
Yeah, some of the farmers that I talk to, they're like, "Oh yeah, we won't see our sheep for 8 months.
No,
They'll be totally fine." That's awesome.
yeah, they do really well. They just turn out. They're the name Herdwick is Viking. It's Norse, comes from Old Norse, and that area of the Lake District. Um, so the north of England was under the Danelaw, so lots of Viking settlements, and it survives in lots of place names, lots of names. So Herdvik translates to sheep farm or sheep enclosure. That's where their name originally comes from, and they have a really old genome, so it's not proven, but it's probably likely that they were brought over, that they have links to sheep brought over
Wow,
from
that's
the
fascinating.
Vikings. And there's still sort of lots of practices around. So they notch the ears of certain flocks so that you know that that's your flock, and that's an old Norse practice that survived thousands of years.
Wow.
So some people still practice lug or ear notching. Obviously, everything's tagged in this country now as well. And it survives in like unique sort of farming names as well. There's a really great word that's like a northern dialect word for when sheep are cast. So you know when pregnant sheep like get on their back and they can't get up. And it's called rig welter. And that is a northern term for when that happens. So a sheep is rig welter, it's stuck on its back, and that's Norse. And it survives through thousands of years of just being passed down in these kind of isolated farming communities who did things in very specific ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that the traditions are still there. We're in sort of near the Durham Dales, and still a lot of the older farmers practice what you might think are like superstitions, maybe, I don't know, but like there's a tradition of putting the tup, so putting the rams in on bonfire night so that you get your lambing for the 1st of April. So a lot of people still follow that and put their tups out on bonfire night. On
What is
Guy Fawkes
bonfire
Night.
night?
It's Guy Fawkes Night. It's the 5th of November. It's when we commemorate the capture of Guy Fawkes, who was a Catholic who tried to blow up Parliament. It's a
Oh,
very,
fascinating.
very English tradition. We have bonfires and fireworks and lots of traditions around it. I find it fascinating that even though lots of sort of larger scale commercial farms have moved away from that because they need lambing seasons that are longer and fit in, and they stagger and they start much earlier. But the people that are still farming not massive flocks still seem to follow that, and I think it's just quite a nice kind of, it's just tradition, I suppose. And
Yeah.
tradition weird like that can sometimes just be a bit ambiguous, can't it? But I suppose 1st of April, April Fool's Day lambing to
Wow,
be,
that's awesome.
yeah. And I think given like that things have obviously changed now because people can bring their like stock into sheds and things, but traditionally people would have been lambing outside, which is why you needed your good weather to start in April, and you needed a lambing season that wasn't going to be too cold, or you didn't have too much risk of snow and things.
That's such a cool fact. Can you share some more interesting facts about farming in the UK?
Yeah, I think it's so long, and I think because it's so woven through our history, I feel like that's what I find fascinating. It's so interlinked and tangled the way it comes down to us. A lot of the early farming, sort of through the Middle Ages, was done by the monasteries. So they ran massive, massive sheep flock numbers, like thousands and thousands and thousands of sheep in their care, and they got really wealthy off their sheep
Mm.
rearing. And then that system passes into the country house system. So the large country houses held masses of land, masses and massive, and had small tenant farms on them who did their farming essentially. And then they paid rent and things. But the system stayed for so long in this country, and it's still kind of, in many places, it's still there. So we're really close to Raby Castle, which is a medieval castle, and they are still one of the largest landlords for tenant farmers in our region. So when you drive through that area, all of their tenant farms are painted white, they're lime washed, and everywhere you look across the landscape, running from County Durham towards Cumbria, belongs to them, so that everybody's a tenant farmer still for them. It's lasted, even though that system has sort of crumbled since the First World War, really, and particularly the Second World War. It's just the patterns have still kind of stayed, and I love that you can trace it through the landscape still. Like when you're driving, you can still look across the fields and see the remnants of rig and furrow, a type of medieval farming system where oxen rather than horses were used to plough. And it creates this really unique kind of bumping in the landscape where things were grown on the top of the ridge and things were grown in the bottom of the ridge, different things that needed different water levels and things like that. It's a really old system of farming, and obviously horses replace the oxen, but it marks our landscape still.
Mm.
And a lot of them are protected, which is wonderful. So you can't plough them up. You can graze sheep and things on them. But I love that you can still read so much of that history everywhere you go across our landscape. It's just marked. It's still there. And you pass old sheep dips where the sheep were washed in the rivers, and there's all these remnants everywhere you look of it. And I always find that really fascinating. I think it makes you feel linked
Yeah.
to the past. I think when I kind of got more into farming, other side of things with my partner who follows that, I think it gives you a really different view of life and the seasons and the pattern and kind of how big, how small you are and how everything continues in this cycle. And I think you're really tied into the seasons in a really different way. I think about the seasons really differently because you think about, and I think there's something in it where you think you're doing the same thing that people have just done here for centuries and centuries. And the way that people got ready for lambing season, the way that people got ready for this season, it's just you're part of this long, linked kind of circle. And I think
Mhm.
it makes you think about time in a less linear, progressive kind of way that you're part of something so long.
Interesting. Yeah. Hmm. I guess I even experienced that to some extent here, and I'm not looking out at the horizon and seeing
Yeah.
history really,
Yeah.
seeing trees. That's
You're
really
still part
fascinating.
of that cycle, aren't you? You're still part of, you know that that's coming every year, no matter what. And I think there's something quite
Mhm.
reassuring in that, even when the world feels quite crazy, life and nature and things just continues. And I
Mhm.
think that's quite something quite nice in that for
Yeah.
me.
When you think about your year in the UK, like what are some of your favorite times of year? I loved visiting when we got to see the flowers, and I know that I
Yeah.
wasn't even there during peak flower
Yeah,
season.
you were here a little bit early. I I love living somewhere where there's these seasons, and I value the kind of distinctness between the seasons. But I love spring. I think that kind of when everything starts to come to life again. And it's one of my favorite times to walk, like in the Yorkshire Dales, walk all our. We've obviously got miles and miles of accessible public footpaths, so you can walk through farmland and really feel like you're in it. You're walking through people's kind of daily businesses, I suppose, where they're farming, but um, you can walk through the sort of and see all the lambs in the field and see the daffodils coming up and see the crocuses coming up, and that's one of my favorite times of year, I would say. Um, and every season has its special things, doesn't it? But I think it's a very busy time for farmers, obviously, like they're flat out. But I think from people that I know that are really quite more, maybe more intense farmers, there's something that they really do look forward to about lambing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think even though it's so labor intensive, there's something so rewarding, I think, about it. And we walk when my partner has done his sort of when the big flux of lambing is over and you walk around and he's turned his sheep out in the field and he just sort of quietly watches them. And I think that that's super rewarding. You've kind of poured so much energy into because it is pretty intensive. And then it's just lovely to see, I think. I also like summer. There's always so much going on in summer. I've spoken to American friends who are always really shocked at like the amount of tractors that are just going through like all the villages and the towns. And obviously they're flat out in the summer, but I love watching them work in the summer as well. And then when they start combining in autumn, I think there's always if you're in a community like ours, you're just surrounded by it all the time. So everywhere you look, when you look out across the fields, they're all working so hard. Everywhere you see, there's tractors and there's things going on. And I
Yeah.
think even though we're a bit quite close to some big major cities. You're still so linked to it. You still see it everywhere. It's still kind of part of most sort of life. You can access it really. You're not really, really removed from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is nice.
I've kind of been wondering for people who are urban people who live in Manchester or
Hmm.
maybe London, like I'm sure there are people who are super disconnected from it, but it seems like it could be right next door to them if they
Yeah.
were able to just like drive a little bit. I'm wondering, like, what's your perspective on how young people are thinking about farming, how urban people are thinking about farming?
We've seen there's obviously been some political stuff going on in this country with the inheritance tax rule change that has had a real pushback. And farmers, I think we saw when that happened, how supported actually. So um public kind of opinion of farming and farmers is very high. So even people that are city dwellers and things um really value farming and the contribution that farming makes to this country, and really value the farmers. There was so much support for the farmers when they protested, and I think that's really nice to see. I think for the farmers that was really nice to see, because I think it can sometimes feel like unthankful work. They're not turning massive profits in this country. It is hard graft. They are working really hard, sort of being hit with a million different things from a million different angles, things that are out of your control as well, like bad weather and some really poor kind of harvests and flooding and all sorts of things. And I think it made people feel quite appreciated. I hope it did. And kind of what farming brings to both our economy, which is quite a lot, um, as well as what it brings culturally. And I think that in terms of my kind of background and my heritage and history background, I've done a lot of work on concepts of Englishness and how we kind of think about our national identity. And um, the English have always thought of themselves as like a pastoral kind of nation. And even as things changed after the Industrial Revolution, there's this like constant mourning and grief for our lost kind of agricultural basis. And I think a lot of when you look at kind of where people visit, both English people and people coming from abroad, what they're searching for, what they think of when they think of England, it's rural England, it's the countryside, it's little villages, it's rolling fields of dry stone walls. We think about ourselves and our national parks, so our kind of a lot of the countryside is we're really, I think we talked about like walking, how much people are into walking, but people really do value the countryside. They value walking and village life, and you can see that in the kind of areas that get all the tourism, particularly things like the Lake District National Park and the Yorkshire Dales are so well known, and they get millions and millions of people who want to just be in that landscape and be in that environment and see those things going on. And we've seen a massive kind of uptick in like farm stays, or so like Airbnbs on farms, or going along for lambing and things like that. I think Utree do some things with their herdwicks. I think there's probably a desire, if you're slightly urbanized as well, to connect to that. We know that there's so much kind of research around well-being and green space, and there's a pull to agricultural life and rural life, definitely.
I see the same thing here, even more so since like 2020, just people really, they're so desperate to get outside and
Yeah.
connect to farms. Well, they were. Like, I'm hoping that we don't lose that momentum. I feel
Yeah.
like we are starting to kind of lose it already, but when I visited Utree, they were kind of talking like, I know this sounds crazy to you because I'm a farmer as well, but they're like,
Mhm.
we're just going to host people to pet the sheep. Like,
Yeah.
it's like basically an adult petting
I
zoo.
think they do like hug a herdwick today.
Yeah, hug a herdwick. But it's so true. I mean, there are just so many people who've never touched a sheep before. That'd be
There's something
amazing
really
experience.
valuable in that, I think, for people that are quite urbanized. I think there is some real value in maybe those things that we take for granted and linking people. I've seen a real kind of post-COVID as well, and then with the things that are happening in farming, a lot more conscious like shopping habits. So people are more aware of where their food is coming from, uh, more aware of supporting local businesses, butchers and grocers. And there's definitely been a kind of focus on Buy British. You see it a lot in our shops, so things are marked with the Union flag. And I hope that that stays because I think that that's an important element to value the kind of high welfare farming that we have here and the way it produces really high quality food. So we're particularly really like self-sustaining on quite a few cereal crops, but also dairy. Like we produce such good dairy in this country. I think you probably take that for granted, and it's in
Yeah.
part due to our landscape and the breeds that we use. There is a lot of support for dairy, and there's been a huge shift in shopping habits that have moved away um, from dairy alternatives and back to like full fat, which is not full
Yeah.
milk, but like back to whole milk, back to proper
Mhm.
butter, back to buying proper yogurts, British dairy. There's been a huge uptick in people spending money on that. People are definitely more kind of conscious of that. And we're still consuming a lot as a nation, which is good.
I loved
So
visiting and seeing along the countryside. There's popping up a lot more and more of the milk vending machines.
yeah,
I
there's
thought that
loads.
was cute.
They're
Yeah.
great. There's quite a few on the local farms, and
Yeah.
they're obviously been really well received. So they're great. There's loads of different ones near us. So there's places that do raw milk, so unpasteurized, and then also there's places that do it with all the flavors and things. But it's
That's
such
cool.
a great kind of yeah. I think linking people. I think people love that experience of going to the farm and
Hmm.
getting the product from the farm, cutting out the supermarkets. And I think like we can only do more of that. I hope to see more of that
Yeah.
across with other things. We're not particularly great sustainability wise or sufficient wise in terms of like fruit and veg, but that's kind of obviously a climate thing as well.
Hmm.
Um, but it would be nice to see more as our population's kind of growing a little bit, to have a bit better food security because we're an island
Hmm.
nation. I think we need to be
Yeah.
wary of that in the current
Um,
climate.
I would think you guys are also pretty self-sufficient in lamb, right?
Yeah, lamb is our number one. That's probably because we produce so much of it, but also changing eating habits.
Mhm.
So lamb and mutton were an integral part of English cuisine for a really, really long time, and they've kind of fallen off. So not
Yeah.
mutton particularly, but a lot of people don't eat lamb anymore. I would like to see a bit of an uptick in it actually, because we produce really good lamb and mutton, and we have the ability to kind of do so. We have all the different breeds. It would be nice to kind of see people eating a bit more. I don't know what has particularly driven that shift
Yeah.
towards like poultry, and I think we eat a lot of pork. We can't keep up with the amount of pork, and we're really good on sort of welfare of cattle and sheep and things. I think there's definitely room for improvement on poultry and pigs.
Yeah.
Pig rearing. It'd be nice to see, because I don't farmers work so hard in this country to uphold really high welfare standards that you don't want to see imported meat that doesn't have the same standards that it's raised here. So it would be nice to be a bit more sustainable on that. How you shift people's palate back to
Back
mutton
to
and
lamb is
lamb.
a hard one.
Yeah, back to mutton and lamb, which were really like it's only a relatively recent shift, really.
Yeah.
You don't see it on a lot of menus anymore. You used to see it on a lot of menus, particularly for like Sunday roasts, like lamb would always be an option. But I don't see it that often anymore.
Yeah, that's so crazy. I'm sure it just is like globalization and media. Here in the States, when people find out that I raise sheep, I always get two questions. What would you raise sheep for? Because people don't realize that sheep equals lamb equals meat. Most people haven't even tried lamb. Or
Mm.
they hear that my sheep don't have wool because I have hair sheep. Here
Okay.
we're closer to the tropics. And so, that's also a huge question. It's like, well, why would you raise sheep if you can't shear their wool? So many people have never even tried lamb, have never seen it on a menu. It's definitely not promoted in movies by any means. It's always
Yeah.
hamburgers and chicken nuggets. And I think that has extended globally. I talked to several farmers in Africa, and
Hmm.
they import so much chicken and pork from Germany or China when they've had ruminant animals on their landscapes for thousands of
Yeah.
years.
Yes, it's not weird that it's still that it's everywhere, but that shift has happened. It is a really relatively recent one. I would say that most of our sheep are there's like a sort of demographic distinction. So, goat and sheep are still really popular meats in certain immigrant communities in this country. So,
Yeah, here too.
uh, yeah, so they will be eaten a lot in certain parts of the country. I would say that that's probably where most people's sheep are going.
Yeah, same. I literally only market to people from other countries.
It's such a good meat, and it's so
Yeah.
for us, it's such an easy kind of one to raise. I don't know how you would push it. I'm thinking about some of the kind of more period historical times where there's been kind of government pushes for milk or government pushes for this or that. I wonder how you change the palate of a nation.
Yeah.
Quite strange.
Mm.
Um, but I suppose our local butchers stock it. Um, but I imagine it's not bought as much as chicken and pork and beef. I think those are probably the big three.
Yeah. Can you just kind of, well, first of all, is there anything else that you want to cover that we haven't?
I think we were talked about what made the North special. And I think there's lots of different things that make the North special and farming in the North special. There's so many experiences you can have kind of around farming. I always think one that's probably confusing for people coming from maybe America particularly because of the way you kind of conceptualize land ownership
Yeah.
um, is like common land and communal grazing. So the fact that like flocks are kind of just turned out onto to commons essentially, and
Mm.
then they're gathered up and split into their kind of relevant flocks after spending the kind of summer. The gathers are really cool. I've seen lots more farmers, particularly like in the Lake District and even in the Yorkshire Dales, advertising basically saying we're doing our gather on this day and you can come along on foot. And they some of them take the quads, it depends on the landscape. They take lots of farmers, lots of dogs, and you go
Mm.
on foot and you essentially collect these thousands of sheep from up in the fells and things. It's really cool. So I think if anybody has a chance to go to gather, like what a great kind of experience into a really different way of farming and a kind of something that's so unchanged. I think that's really nice. Um, I think with the did we talk about we've talked about the kind of landscape a little bit, so the hedgerows and the dry stone walls and things. They're a sort of iconic part of that English landscape. I think people don't realize how old they are. Like,
Yeah.
so they're really old. Some of the hedgerows date back to the Bronze Age. A lot of them are medieval. They're really, really, really biodiverse. They're amazing. So both the dry stone walls and the hedgerows are full of life. They create these little havens where sometimes there's not a lot of trees and things for little woodland birds and for insects and for hogs, and they create this protective little like wildlife highway essentially that
Yeah.
animals can move through. We've lost about 50% of our hedgerows since the Second World War,
Mm.
but there's been a big drive with some government initiatives and charities as well to reinstate. So there's a big kind of conservation movement to bring back a lot of hedges. They're laid in they're traditionally laid, so they cut them and laid them, and then they mesh together to create these. We don't need fences. Um, and then lots of work as well at like repairing dry stone walls. It's a really old technique of building walls without mortar so that you kind of interweave your walls. It's such a fascinating thing to see. And they were done when the The fields were cleared of stones essentially. And to think that that technique got handed down for like millions of years is amazing. A
Yeah.
lot of a lot of the ones that you see now actually date from the 18th century onwards. From the 1600s, we had something called the Enclosure Acts. So there were a number of different acts of parliament that essentially took away that common kind of farming system, common lands that had been used since the Anglo-Saxon period, and enclosed them into private parcels of land. So it changed the landscape into what we think of now, into these smaller field systems with their walls and their hedgerows. It changed rural life as well because it drove a lot of people out of rural communities and into towns. And this was a real kind of shift for the agricultural and the industrial revolutions. It created a lot of poverty because of the way it complete sort of land ownership went into certain areas and then not others, and people couldn't survive. But that's really shaped a lot of how farming is done now, I suppose, and that's the pattern that people are probably thinking of now. And they go, the Yorkshire Dales is really unique landscape actually as well. I think you'll have seen that when you're there. For such a small island, really like Britain, and then within our kind of constituent nations, there's such a range of kind of geography and landscape for such a small place. And I think that that's always quite fascinating. So you can go to these different regions and they look so different. And the stone is different, so the buildings are different, and the styles are different, and the stonework is different, and the way that they do something here to 20 miles away is different. And
Yeah.
there's you can look at kind of pictures and kind of place exactly where they are in England, and the Yorkshire Dales is unique in its landscape, which you'll have seen when you were there.
Yeah, it was
Like,
amazing.
yeah, it's beautiful, and these kind of the dales rolling through with the kind of patchwork of dry stone walls, and also all the field barns. There's thousands and thousands of field barns that were built from sort of the 1600s onwards, where they were a bit further away from some of the farmsteads, but they would cut the hay meadows in the summer and then store the hay, and it allowed them to kind of have these little satellite. They're often called lathe is the term, but cow house, and the um cattle would overwinter in them and things, and it allowed a bit more productivity without moving things to and from the main farmstead, which was really labor intensive. But that's such a unique thing to the Dales, like looking through down the Dale and seeing all those old ancient field barns dotting the
Yeah.
landscape. Is so nice.
I think the preservation of history in each little unique area is pretty fascinating. It was so cool to see. And especially because, younger generations of America aren't really learning about that part of England anymore.
Mhm.
I don't know if it is Hollywood driven. Honestly, a lot of our things are very just culturally driven, but we learn so much about royalty and about the
Yeah.
estates and the big houses. Even now, every third person I know is watching some kind of English countryside show, but it's about royalty or it's about wealthy families
Yeah.
in some way. So I think that coming and seeing it myself in person and like hearing perspectives like yours that are just like actually English is like really, really valuable.
I think the value of our there's something I always try to pinpoint it. There's something in our culture that has always valued our heritage. I think we that's why we've kept a lot of it. Um, it's quite an old value, I think, really. We didn't knock things down, we just kind of repurposed them. And I think even in it's not just our castles or our stately homes that are preserved. It's everywhere, and you'll have seen that when you come around. The villages are preserved, the pubs are preserved, the little field barns are preserved. People do. There's a lot of value still in that vernacular kind of heritage, and for me, that's England as well. You know, and I love the history of stately homes, and I love those things. That's also not my history. I have a working class family background, and um, I think you find the essence of England in those rural communities.
Mhm.
I think one of my favorite things is when we go to the mart So there's still quite a few small marts where you take your livestock to sell them and then you bid on them. And I love going along. I sort of tag along just because I find it the most fascinating sort of social experience. It feels like an ability to step back in time to like an older England. And I think it's because a lot of our farmers are quite old actually.
Hmm.
It's tipped on that end, but there's just something um you get a real sense of community. Like people really know each other still. They really know their areas. They really know their family links. They uh they carry their history. And I always think that particularly about our rural communities. They are really such experts in their history. I moved a building for work. We moved a farmhouse um that was derelict. It's just across the sort of dale from us, and there's hundreds and hundreds of these farmhouses that disappeared as the lead mines closed and the farming practices changed. And we moved this building, uh, and we couldn't get to the bottom of the name. It was called Spainsfield, and we couldn't figure out. It appeared loads of different spellings on maps from the medieval period onward, and uh, when I went into that community, they immediately knew like what the name was.
Wow.
So it's a corruption of Speansfield, and Speen is a dialect word in this region in Weardale for weaning. So when you wean, you separate your lambs from the mothers. That would be the field that you would put them in, and it was so obvious to them. And it made
Wow.
me really shift in like how I thought about um experts, like that you're not an expert, that actually people are really well versed in their own history and their own landscape. They know it really well. And I love going out into those rural communities because they carry so much of their history with them and they know their landscape so so well. And
Yeah.
it made me think really differently about sort of not waltzing into a situation, with a certain educational background or whatever, but that actually people know a lot of their own kind of and carry their own history really well. And I think you find that when you go into rural parts of England, I always encourage if people are visiting from abroad, particularly America and places as well, but from anywhere that you go and get into these kind of communities because I think that that's where you feel the core of
Yeah.
or with the culture shock, but you feel the core of what makes England England when you get out
Hmm.
there. You can visit castles and stately homes and things, but you go to the pub with some of those farmers and you feel it. You feel
Yeah,
the way that they think about where they're from.
definitely.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a beautiful story. Yeah, I just with planning both my impromptu trip last year, but then also this trip this year,
Mhm.
um, I had a couple people ask, like, well, are we going to go see all the castles and like all the things? And like, that is not this trip. It was just a really amazing opportunity to really get to feel like it was real life, get to
Yeah.
actually meet like genuine down to earth farmers and see what is still like still preserving that everyday way of life now is really special.
Yeah, I think that is a huge that would have been for me like a draw for your trip to like you can I love visiting, like don't get me wrong, I love historic buildings of any kind, but there's something so different to be found in not a sort of presented history of the past
Mhm.
via going through a heritage organization, but actually a lived kind of passed on every day. People living in the buildings that and living in the communities that their ancestors lived in and farming farms that their great 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 grandparents farm. Those are really different
Yeah.
things. Um, we went for a walk in the Yorkshire Dales and we bumped into a really old farmer and he was fifth generation on their farm. And I said to Colin when we were walking, imagine that you grew up here, your parents grew up on that farm, your great grandma, that how you understand that landscape so differently. And it was when we were talking about it was right sort of as the inheritance tax came along. And I said, how do you convey that intangible value to people that live in the city? that make these kind of
Yeah.
policies and things, how could they ever comprehend what it means to be fifth generation, hundreds of years on your farm, and all the stories and all the links and the way you know your community and the way you know your land? How can you, if you don't experience that, if you've not had an in on that, how can you convey that? It's so intangible. It maybe doesn't translate on paper to a certain amount of profit, or that small scale farms aren't viable or whatever, but like there's an intangible value system that I fear of losing with the loss of small scale farms. And
Yeah.
I think those are irreplaceable values, and you can't put monetary
Definitely.
kind of things against them. Once they're gone, and they're they've been threaded and woven through our culture and our history for centuries. I fear those being lost, and I don't know how do you convey that to people that live in an urbanized setting that don't have that same kind of link to landscape, community, seasons. It would be nice to kind of foster those links a bit more.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure. Can you just share like a personal story of why it's important for you to preserve this way of life?
Yeah, I don't know whether this is like a personality trait or because I have always been sort of deeply, um, I've always loved the countryside. I've always loved heritage since I was little. It's why I followed this path. It's why I work for a heritage organization. And I think as I got more into farming by Carl, it's particularly sort of bolstered my desire um to to ensure that this remains. I think being in a rural community, and I didn't grow up in one. I grew up in Manchester, so I grew up in a city. I've had access to animals. I had horses, like I was into horses and things growing up, but not farm animals. Um, and I think being in a rural community really changes the way you think about community. It changes the way you think about your ties to the land, the way you feel about your area. I live in County Durham, so it's still very, very rural, one of the least populated English counties. And I've run into farming all the time, but I, it's a hard one to convey, like to people in the city, because sometimes I think people can be a bit dismissive. Why does it matter if we do just like get rid of family farms and import everything? We can just import everything from the EU. And um I think the loss of the family farm would be so destructive for this country. In terms of many, many things, it would completely transform the landscape. It would mean that a lot of land went for building, and you would become more urbanized. So you'd see a loss of your countryside, a loss of open space, uh, a kind of loss of the traditional landscape that we really associate. It would mean a lot of people would lose access to green spaces. But it also means like a loss of animal welfare in terms of our food security. But I think it's a cultural thing. I think it's woven through who we are, and I feel like that's worth protecting. Rural communities still hold a lot of they're not super traditional anymore, but they hold a lot of values that I think are quite important. So like a sense of custodianship, a way of thinking about the land, a way of thinking about their community, helping one another, and
Yeah.
sort of being quite like like linked in, kind of not community dependent, but like there's a lot. Growing up in Manchester and then living out here, I see how different life is, and how much value I think people get from living in these smaller these life is hard. It is really hard work for farmers right now. I do feel for lots of people who really depend on farming for their livelihood. It is not easy. They're struggling. I think there's a lot of policy shifts we could make in this country to really support them. But it's great to see the public behind them. And I think there's a yearning in this country for a kind of the values that are represented in farming and in rural communities. I think people maybe feel that those are missing from their lives, like a bit of a void. I think if you live in somewhere that's really urbanized and you have a very urbanized life, there's something not there, is there? There's something, um, I think there's something very human, and that's how we're meant to live. That's how we lived for most
Yeah.
of our existence, linked to the land, linked to the seasons,
Mhm.
following that pattern of life. And I think urbanization's obviously removed us from that. And there's probably, to our detriment, hugely. And I think that that's why people still choose that hard life. It might probably be very easy for a lot of farmers to just think, I'm going to throw the towel in, like it's just too hard. But it isn't a job, is it? It's like a vocation. It's their life. It's who they are. It's imprinted in them. And I'm really grateful. We have so many like really hardworking farmers that work so hard, really great welfare. There's lots of really good stuff going on in terms of like conservation and like land management, where we've kind of seen a bit of um loss of kind of habitat and overuse of soil and things. But I think if you feel tied to your place, you care for it better, don't you? You look
Yeah.
after it and you look after your community a bit better.
Hmm. Yeah, that's beautifully said. Thank you. I love it. I think that's a great way to end it if that's all right with you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Super. If you enjoyed this episode today, next week and the following, I will be posting interviews from other folks in the UK. One, a farmer in this area we chatted about, and then another, a basket weaver in Scotland. I think it will all blend together very seamlessly, so tune into those.